Good morning, rabies and germs. My name's McConnaughay, and this is the second edition of the Out of Frame podcast. And for this edition, I thought it'd be topical and relevant to shine a light on this year in the film industry. I didn't have a lot of revelations since last week's upload as far as writing is concerned, although we're now only a little over a week until Scott and I bring our novel, The Kane's Files, for our second comic expo. I also have copies of my novel, Cataline the Hollow, available at a highly discounted price. This doesn't matter to most of you, since most of you are way far away from the area, but I'll let you know how the expo goes. At this point for me, and I think for Scott as well, it's about putting ourselves out there and trying to bring our work to a larger audience. If you guys are interested, you can always find my work by searching my name on Amazon or following the link in the description. Since I don't have a whole lot to say right now and I don't want to be stagnant, I figured this week I'd look into the not-so-distant archives to share my thoughts on 5 films that were released this year. These being the film adaptation of the popular video game franchise Tomb Raider, the latest iteration in Adam Sandler's monster movie mashup, Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation, a rarity in this day and age with the slasher film Strangers Prey at Night, the first Marvel film since the events of Infinity Wars with Antman and the Wasp, and finally, the long-awaited follow-up to Pixar's beloved classic, Incredibles 2. First up to bat is Tomb Raider. Although it has been said enough to become an exhaustive cliché, video games very rarely translate well on the big screen. This could happen for more than one reason, and we've had such a large sampling of examples it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly what's lost in translation as far as making a popular video game franchise into a blockbuster film. Blood Rain was directed by Uwe Boll, and so it's easy to understand the mistake as far as that's concerned. It can be bogged down with explanation and backstory, like Silent Hill, which atmospherically, although not a film I enjoy, I can understand saying it's the best adaptation of a video game we've seen. Or you can find that what everyone likes about a video game isn't able to be captured as well in a film, like Ratchet & Clank. Although a lot of people don't like the mainstream Resident Evil film series, how many of you have watched the in-universe animated films for the series? I have. They play out like very dull, extended cutscenes. For a film adaptation to succeed, it needs to walk a fine line from following the source material, and at the same time having the gumption to merit its own worth as a film. 2018's Tomb Raider is the third film based on the titular video game series and acts as a reboot of the Tomb Raider series, adapting the darker subject matter seen in the more recent Tomb Raider video games. Does it succeed at walking the fine line? Directed by Roar Uthaug, otherwise known for the Norwegian disaster drama film The Wave, Tomb Raider received mixed reviews from critics. I would call it a lukewarm reaction and an uptick from what's become the norm for video game adaptations. The film, which stars Alicia Vikander as Lara Croft, did modestly at the box office. Produced with a slightly smaller production budget than the Angelina Jolie-fronted Lara Croft Tomb Raider, the film nearly surpassed the original with only a little over $1 million separating them. Some will argue that the Jolie film was miles more successful at the box office when you account for inflation. And you'd be right, however, you have to keep in mind that inflation will also have connotations for the production budget as well. The deal breaker for the new Tomb Raider stems from the fact that nearly 80 million of its 273 million worldwide gross came from China, a country that takes a 75% cut of a film's theater total. By the looks of it, according to my calculations and my analyzations, which are educated approximates at best, the new film looks as though it may have barely broken even on its theatrical total. This isn't horrible, but it means the home video sales will be the main source of profit, and for a large-scale production such as this, Warner Brothers likely isn't breaking down anyone's doors to fast-track a sequel. As I said earlier, the film is more an adaptation of the 2013 video game and the 2015 video game that followed, both of which provided a darker, grittier approach than what was seen with the Angelina Jolie films. The film follows Lara Croft embarking on a journey in search of her father's last known destination, only to uncover a secret organization called Trinity, and more questions about her father's mysterious disappearance. A fan of the video game series, I would say that I think the film is a faithful adaptation in terms of establishing what was important in the series itself. A criticism I heard in regards to the portrayal of Lara Croft is that she was a bland punching bag of a character in this film. Something curious I find about that is that it's an actual criticism I heard about the 2013 video game, although in that regard, it had more to do with how her environment outmatched her again and again. I think this is deliberately how they've chosen to portray Lara Croft. I'm benefited by happenstance since it's unlikely we'll see a follow-up sequel to Tomb Raider, but if she's a weak character, she's a more grounded character that is slowly developing into the phenomenon that is Tomb Raider. This is an origin story of her coming into her own like the 2013 video game, and if 2015's Rise of the Tomb Raider would have been a little like where they were headed, her character will continue to develop and succeed. As far as the criticism that Lara Croft is portrayed as bland in this film, I think Alicia Vikander injected more personality into her than what we'd seen in the source material. The statement comes with an asterisk because I also think that Lara Croft's character has never been very developed or colorful. The whole appeal of Lara Croft isn't that she is a well-written character. She's the survivor that soon transitions from hunted to hunter. The reason that the Tomb Raider video games work is because while she's passable enough for a character, the character itself isn't under a microscope for prolonged amounts of time. For instance, in this film and in other video game entries, they have the emotional subplots about Laura's father, Richard Croft. But the honest truth, from my perspective, is that while I care about her plight, I care only enough to wait for what I really came for. The fun platforming, puzzle solving, Tomb Raiding gameplay, and without that fun factor, Tomb Raider as a whole isn't left with very much. The action sequences feel enjoyable and at times like they're brought straight out from the source material, but without any substance, it's difficult to register worth beyond that. The opening minutes of the Tomb Raider film are fun and enthusiastic, but everything thereafter feels paint by the numbers and workmanlike. It feels like it's checking off boxes, introducing a large-scale organization called Trinity, but never actually doing anything to make me care about them. The dynamic with Lara and her father is shown about the same respect as it is with the video games, but the video games had the added crutch of being a lot of fun, and thereby I was willing to overlook cliched or wishy-washy moments. This is actually where I want to leave my thoughts on Tomb Raider, because I think what I said earlier at the start of my review pretty well summarizes what I think went wrong with the film. Like the Ratchet & Clank film or many others, I think you could take the script of this film, even take the voice actors, all of it, and scene for scene, I think we'd be singing its praises as a video game experience. However, looking at it as a film, it doesn't have enough interesting things to say or inspired ideas to really carry itself as a feature-length cinematic experience. It isn't an awful film, it simply isn't one that draws very much reaction at all. I would give it a 5 out of 10, rating it average. Second up on the chop block is Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation. Hotel Transylvania is a film franchise I've never really enjoyed a whole lot, which begs the question of why I even bothered to buy a ticket to Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation at all, if I intended to be a sourpuss and gripe about it. I wouldn't say I despise them, rather I think they go down easier than the average Adam Sandler fare, benefited by the visual gags and zany animation. The issue really is I've always considered them very lightweight. If Disney and thereby Pixar bolster the best animation in terms of production value and storytelling, at least in mainstream United States cinema, next would be DreamWorks, and then after that, Warner Brothers Animation, and then battling for their own spot, Illumination and Sony Pictures Animation would meet. Obviously, Illumination is much more successful, but they're both cut from the very same cloth. Their films certainly stand taller than animations like Norm of the North or The Nut Job, but they have a certain lack of polish and an approach more attuned to the interest of the younger crowd, whereas other companies like Pixar and so on feel like their films are accessible to children without feeling abhorrent to adults. The Hotel Transylvania series has always carried a zany but contrived execution, more about providing a basic vehicle for Adam Sandler gang-related gags and humor than about a substantial film. They're casual, they're junk food. Be that as it may, I think Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation stands as the best in the series yet. Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation is directed by Jenny Tartakovsky and written by Tartakovsky and Michael McConaughey. I feel like I just butchered his last name, by the way. Following the cast of Adam Sandler, Andy Samberg, Selena Gomez, as well as many others, many who have appeared in a lot of Sandler-related films. From a box office standpoint, the new film is pacing about on par from the previous installments, at least from a domestic standpoint. It is currently, as of this writing, behind Hotel Transylvania 2, but ahead of the first film, at least on the domestic front. However, to my surprise and to many other people's surprise, is whenever Hotel Transylvania 2 overperformed compared to the first film, we thought that was kind of going to be the roof of the series, that was going to be as high as it could go, but as it turns out, Hotel Transylvania 3 just recently crossed $500 million at the worldwide box office, meaning Jesus. It's clear with the current numbers the series has maintained an audience, and if Sony's interested, I don't see very much stopping them when it comes to making a Hotel Transylvania 4, so long as none of their audience goes out and purchases that god-awful looking Hotel Transylvania video game released in unison with the film and decides they hate the franchise now. The storyline is straightforward. It has been over a century since Count Dracula has been romantically involved with anyone, and over a century since the death of his wife, Martha. Oblivious to this, Mavis attributes his behavior to the fact he's overworked and in need of family time, and books them on a monster cruise hosted by a woman named Erica, who in the trailers as well is revealed to be a member of the Van Helsing family that wishes to eliminate Dracula. The reason I went and watched Hotel Transylvania 3 is mostly to do with the fact my fiance gets a kick out of the series. It's a guilty pleasure on the order of whenever I go out and watch a full moon feature film, and I find them agreeably competent. A worry I had, and one that might have occurred to you, has to do with the name and premise of the film itself. The worry I had is that Summer Vacation was indicative that the series had run out of ideas when it was effectively phoning it in with the subsequent release. I believed this heading into the theater until it dawned on me the series' storylines have always been very thrown together, especially with the Hotel Transylvania 2 film. As I've said, the series does the bare minimum in terms of storyline in order to have a vehicle to entertain children with its colorful decor and silly characters. In this film, I left with the belief it even has a slightly better story dynamic than what was seen in the last couple of films. Mind you, the storyline remains riddled with cliches, predictable outcomes, and ham-fisted Fox attempts at nuance. From my perspective, the most appealing aspects were the fast-paced gags and vibrant animation, and Hotel Transylvania 3's loose setting gives it the means to stretch its legs some more from what we've seen in what came before. The humor remains very lowbrow, focusing more on entertaining the younger crowd through predictable bodily humor and goofy happenstances. On some level, I factor in the fact of Hotel Transylvania's demographic. However, I am aware of how other animations have been able to walk the line with more grace and more satisfactory results. It isn't that I expect a film like this to have in-depth relationships or dynamics, but enough competence to get by without reliance on generic gags and gratuitous toilet humor. Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation fans can rejoice in knowing the film is the best in the series yet. The film isn't likely to attract in new viewers for the series or buck off any criticisms everyone's had about the series, but it remains a soft-hitting, simple affair, propped up by its restricted but exuberant animation. As far as ratings are concerned, I think that I'm going to go ahead and again give this film a 5 out of 10 and give it an average rating. Although from an entertainment value, I would say that it was more entertaining than Tomb Raider was. And aside from the actual review, what is the loudest you've ever had someone be in a theater? On my end, the accolade is bestowed on a couple of infants brought, for no good reason, to see The Giver on a Friday night. They cried and cried and cried, and listening in, I was even able to hear the mother trying to soothe them by singing in a jam-packed theater. Eventually she bit the bullet and left, but it still blows my mind how inconsiderate some people can be. It'd be different if The Giver was a children's movie and the children can engage themselves in the subject matter, as opposed to sitting idly by while their mother watches the film. For instance, in this recent outing, as a matter of fact, for Hotel Transylvania, a small boy hollered and hooted excitedly, and at the point even chucked his large bag of popcorn across the room, spilling it everywhere. At least I could tell that boy was having the time of his life watching the film. The kid was special needs, in case you wondered why his parents didn't effectively end him right then and there with the popcorn incident. I understand his disturbances might still annoy some people, and honestly, if you pay the price of admission, you have every right to be upset about pterodactyl cries filling the room. But I was able to move on from it. They obviously knew he was going to make a scene and were in the back row, unlike the mother with infants who sat smack dab in the middle. Also, they went to a matinee showing on a weekday, knowing less people would be there and that the price of admission is cut in half, whereas the woman who brought her infants in on opening night. I don't really have an essential lesson to teach about this tangent, but I think reasonability and consideration are more likely to be paid back in equal measures. That said, the brief moment where the small boy moved 3 seats away from his parents and sat on his knees staring at me with a Cheshire cat grin was admittedly unpleasant. Alright, next up is The Strangers Pray at Night. Folks, I was brought up on slasher films, and because of that, even to a fault, I am usually excited when a new one comes out. That said, The Strangers Pray at Night is a 2018 American slasher film I don't think any of us were really clamoring for, at least not a decade after the release of its predecessor, The Strangers. That film, if you'll recall, had an idea that worked for a horror film. The idea of mass psychopaths showing up and wreaking havoc on unsuspecting victims, propelled by neither rhyme nor reason. A because you were home motivation that had been made famous decades prior by the first Halloween, until Halloween 2 revealed Laurie Strode to be Michael Myers' sister. However, as far as delivering the goods, The Strangers was an abysmal affair. I might have looked forward to someone else having a chance to try something with the concept, but by no means did I think The Strangers itself delivered much to stir anticipation of a sequel. The Strangers Pray at Night is directed by Johannes Robert and stars Christina Hendricks, Martin Henderson, Bailey Madison, and Lewis Pullman. I stared at Bailey Madison with uncertainty a long time before I realized I remembered a much younger her in the Don't Be Afraid of the Dark film back in 2010. Written by Brian Bertino, who wrote and directed the first film, and Ben Katai. The film follows a family of 4 who go on a road trip that goes haywire when they find themselves targeted by psychopathic murderers. Although The Strangers 2 wasn't as successful as its predecessors at the box office, it had a much smaller distributor and a smaller budget, allowing it to add up to a modest success. This isn't a complicated film by any stretch of the imagination, and because of that, I was almost leery about what I would even be able to talk about. The characters are introduced and given very simple backstories for themselves, which has become rudimentary in the horror genre. The issue with this, like many other horror films, is that it overstays its welcome and has little to no effect on the events that transpire later in the film. The daughter is depicted as being a troubled youth that resents her parents because they're sending her away to a different school to try and better her behavior. This little tidbit ultimately contributes nothing to the film and feels like it was added in for no other reason than to help the film's runtime achieve feature length. The film features an original score combined with classic songs, Total Eclipse of the Heart, for example, thrown in for good measure. I would say these aspects work to the film's benefit, although I'd also mention they aren't complementing the film in any unique way and are familiarly presented. As a matter of fact, the original score's piano melodies harken back to John Carpenter's classic sound presented in Halloween. Strangers 2 is shot relatively well, once more. I would compare its camera angles as akin to a lot of what was seen in 80s horror. This isn't necessarily an insult, because the 80s were a very pertinent decade for the horror genre. Where it becomes complicated is when homages aren't complemented by fresh ideas and unique execution. Strangers 2 doesn't bolster very many surprises, and in fact is a very conventional slasher film. I did encounter one scene in the film, a jump scare in the early going I liked a fair bit due to the way it was shot and presented. Otherwise though, I can't really say I found anything in this film to single out or talk about. This works in the film's favor and its detriment, however, and perhaps culminates in a statement more damning than that of praise. Strangers Prey at Night is very plain. The film is handled by talented hands, executed with proper technique. It's simply the scenes captured that don't engage. The acting is competent, but they don't have anything to sink their teeth into. The film simply felt forgettable and safe, better made than most of the slasher films it resembles, but with no better ideas. And with that said, as far as ratings are concerned, I'm going to do, for the third time in a row, give it a decent 5 out of 10 rating, which is sort of my way of basically saying I don't have harsh criticisms to give, but I don't have any good compliments to give either. It's just something that you'll have to watch and decide for yourself. I think it doesn't really move the needle one way or the other. Ranking the first 3 films from this podcast, however, I would say that I honestly think Hotel Transylvania 3 is the best film so far. Second, probably Tomb Raider, and then Strangers Prey at Night, if only because Strangers doesn't introduce a whole lot of new things. Alright, fourth on the chop block is Antman and the Wasp. When Antman arrived in 2015, I couldn't help but find myself disappointed in the finished product. In truth, it was an average fare that would have left me satiated had it come in the initial phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Unfortunately, as Marvel's series of films encumbered theaters at a more rampant, abundant rate and began reaching new heights, it was definite to me that Ant-Man simply couldn't tread water to the best of them, providing a lightweight, disposable film that found itself more toward the bottom of the Marvel catalog, while films like Captain America, The Winter Soldier, and Guardians of the Galaxy stood out with home runs for the series in Phase 2. Thankfully, with that said, I feel comfortable saying that Marvel's 20th film in the series, Ant-Man and the Wasp, is a noticeable improvement from its predecessor. But how much of an actual improvement is it? Ant-Man and the Wasp follows where its predecessor left off, as well as after the events of Captain America's Civil War, and before the events of Avengers Infinity War. The Peyton Reed-directed film brings back Paul Rudd as Scott Lang, who is now under house arrest for violation of the Sokovia Accords in Captain America's Civil War, and has since lost ties to Hope and Hank, and as he begins having hallucinations brought on from entering the quantum realm in the previous film, which brings Hope and Hank out of hiding when he claims to have seen Hank's wife in one of his dreams. The film has received a warm reception from critics, a brighter response than what was received for the original Ant-Man film, whereas the box office admittedly leaves something to be desired. The film managed to surpass the original film, however it has to be kept in mind that it has a considerably higher budget. And after Infinity Wars, I would imagine Marvel Studios anticipated the film would receive a financial increase like how Phase 2 films increased after The Avengers was released. Something I felt about Ant-Man with its release is that it had too many cooks in terms of stylization and thematic tone. This is likely due to the troublesome production it underwent, with Edgar Wright being abruptly replaced by Peyton Reed as director. From the get-go, I want to say that I believe Ant-Man and the Wasp not only acts as a superior film to its predecessor, but it feels like a more consistent, functional film altogether. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has always been criticized as depending on more lightheart casualness in contrast to more mature themes. I believe this criticism has been heard by those involved and responded to subsequently with the higher stake, more serious films like Captain America Civil War and Avengers Infinity War. However, films like Thor Ragnarok and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 show Marvel still very much enjoys providing lighter, more comedic entertainment. Personally, as a fan of almost all of the MCU films, I like the approach of getting the best of both worlds. Marvel has a certain style and identity, and I appreciate that it can deal with heavier subject matter while keeping it fun all the way through. That said, Ant-Man and the Wasp is a much lighter affair, and likewise with its predecessor, I think it can be described as lightweight. Fortunately, Ant-Man and the Wasp is a lot more entertaining of an experience than its predecessor, bolstered by the charming performance of Paul Rudd, as well as his supporting cast of characters, which includes a dialed-back performance from Michael Pena, who I thought was a little overboard in the original film. The villain in this film can fairly be described as run-of-the-mill, but I did like the motive of molecular instability, and I thought it added more nuance to her. It's like the portrayal of Vulture in Spider-Man Homecoming, where the villain isn't motivated by cruelty per se, but instead focuses more towards survival. The action sequences are entertaining and vibrant, and the comedy that's incorporated has a very similar novelty to the original film, but I think it's better balanced than that. I think it has moments, particularly when Ant-Man is left trapped in a school building, where I think it is allowed to do some unique things. I will admit that it could have done more than what it did with the concepts from a comedic perspective, but I am mostly satisfied with what we received. Ant-Man and the Wasp can't escape feeling like a holdover film after the grandiose events of Avengers Infinity War, and honestly speaking, similar to sequels like Iron Man 3, it can occasionally feel like it coasts off charm more than substantial subject matter or ideas. The best aspects in the film aren't action scenes or a villain, but the comedic, silly one-liners, usually quipped by Ant-Man himself, and the fast-paced enthusiasm it bolsters. Then again, it is very watchable, and charm or entertainment value isn't something to be discounted. If this was an action comedy from another studio, I think many, including myself, would be able to set aside how it stands with the core series, and would simply appreciate it as a good action film. Now, as far as my rating for Ant-Man and the Wasp is concerned, I'm actually going to go ahead and give it a 7 out of 10, which is actually a big improvement in comparison to the previous 3 films that we have reviewed. It is also an improvement from what I gave the previous Ant-Man film. The final review of the morning is Incredibles 2. Pixar has been a leader in animation ever since it first burst on the scene in 1995 with Toy Story, and in truth, I've been on board all the way through. I've loved almost every film they've released, like Finding Nemo or Monsters, Inc., or Toy Story, or even more recently, their film Coco. The brand has endured and has built a reputation of engaging young and adult moviegoers alike. 8 years into building what has since become a juggernaut regime, they released The Incredibles, a film that performed well at the box office, a huge success for Pixar, perhaps overshadowed by the even greater success had by Finding Nemo a year prior, and received wide approval. I certainly enjoyed The Incredibles, but I think it'd be fair to suggest I didn't covet it in the same way I coveted Toy Story, for instance. I only mention this to say that I was excited for Incredibles 2, but my level of anticipation wasn't the same level that many, my fiancé for example, felt they had been during the last decade and a half. Incredibles 2 has received very positive reviews from critics, a small notch below the weighty reception had by its predecessor, and has received amazing support from a box office perspective. As of this writing, Incredibles 2 has surpassed The Incredibles from a domestic standpoint by a considerable amount, even when adjusted for inflation, and has surpassed The Incredibles worldwide, with a lot left over. As a matter of fact, it's almost at $1.2 billion. In our Brad Bird written and directed sequel, same as the first, Bird's great and known for The Iron Giant, Ratatouille, and unfortunately, Tomorrowland. The story follows the Parr family still, more or less, like they were left, now dealt with having to regain the public's trust of superheroes, revamping the public's perception with the help of a man named Winston Deaver, while Elastigirl is tasked with the heroics leaving poor old Bob, Mr. Incredible, entrusted to look after the kids, a job made more difficult by their infant son Jack and his unpredictable blooming powers. I had a couple of worries in this film heading in. Like Incredibles 2, the long-awaited Finding Dory film received strong box office returns and critical acclaim, but in truth, I was disappointed with Finding Dory as a film. In particular, I found that the film coasted off the nostalgia of the previous film, and while it was a decent film, it wasn't a heavy-hitter follow-up like I would have liked. Seeing the scenarios with Bob and Jack in the trailers, I was afraid the film would play a generic scenario of having Mr. Incredible imploding under the weight of his own ego, and that being the main conflict of the film. Answering the latter's question first, the character of Mr. Incredible is portrayed more selflessly and nuanced than that. The character has an ego to him and wants to be out fighting crime, but understands that in order for his wife to succeed, he needs to succeed, and if nothing else, I appreciate Pixar for portraying Elastigirl as a strong character, without it unnecessarily weakening other characters or adding an unnecessary battle of the sexes storylines to it. As for the second point, Incredibles 2 warrants itself with its fair share of comedic moments that will have the younger audience laughing and should even bring a smile or two from the adult audience. The action scenes and animation itself are also definitely aspects I'd single out. The bombastic action is fast and kinetic, and I think it's what I regard as my favorite part of the film. That and the music composed by Michael Giacchino, which runs the wire of being both beautifully familiar but unique in its own right. Something I also worried about was the villain. The first Incredibles film had a great villain in my opinion, and I was worried they'd think the dynamic itself was enough to warrant the film without a central antagonist, opting instead for a central antagonist through conflict. The film has a villain, however, and I would describe the said villain as passable and capable of inducing epileptic seizures. I would only regard the villain as passable, however. As I watch the film, I'll confess to the predictability of Screenslaver. That's the villain's name, by the way. And that I was able to predict it a mile away. This isn't because of my detective skills, but because the reveal was obvious. That and the motive behind the villain's behavior felt very, very standard. The story itself holds a familiarity as well, whether it be strands shared with its predecessor or similarities it carries with established convention. The film doesn't ask a lot of new, unique questions, and while it earns its keep through its action, humor, and overall presentation, it doesn't necessarily make the most of its potential. Incredibles 2 is a good animated affair, certainly bolstering the production value Pixar and Disney itself usually delivers on that sets it above its competition. But as an overall production, through its standard, predictable storyline and conflicts, it only satiates and satisfies. It isn't incredible. As for what my rating is for this film, I'm actually going to give it a 7 out of 10, similar to what I gave Antman and the Wasp. If I had to pick a favorite amongst the two, I'm thinking I'm going to go with Antman and the Wasp, to be perfectly honest with you, which might be a controversial opinion, perhaps, but I just feel like it had more uniqueness to it. It was a fresher idea, whereas this one, it felt very, very safe. Rabies and Germs, thanks for joining me on this edition of the Out of Frame podcast, where we have looked at 4 blockbuster films as well as The Strangers Pray at Night. Have a good rest of your day. My name is Nicholas McConnaughay, and I'll see you next time.